Louis Freeh is our lead story tonight. He's the man President Clinton wants as director of the FBI. There's an opening there because Mr. Clinton fired William Sessions from that job just yesterday. Louis Freeh is a 43-year-old U.S. District Judge in New York City. He was an FBI agent for 6 years and then a federal prosecutor before going on the bench 2 years ago. Freeh was at the White House this morning with President Clinton for the nomination announcement.
I was born in Jersey City, and from about the age of my eldest son, I wanted to be an FBI agent. It was my first job after law school at age 25. The FBI is the greatest organization for law enforcement ever created by a democratic society. The brave men and women who serve in its ranks exemplify all of our country's police professionals dedicated to ensuring both safety and liberty. If confirmed by the Senate, I pledge my total commitment to a Federal Bureau of Investigation whose only beacon is the rule of law, whose sole task is protecting all of our people from crime and violence. Safety is particularly important for our children and young people, who all too often are now trapped in virtual war zones controlled by vicious criminals. The issue is stark. Do we allow criminals to destroy our Constitution and our freedoms? Or do we, as a people committed to the rule of law, take effective steps to preserve our most basic civil rights, to be protected against harm, to be free from fear, and to enjoy the full measure of liberty and opportunity in this great nation? Anyone doubting the need for an efficient FBI need only read the front page or watch the evening news. What most Americans once thought impossible has now occurred here. A terrorist bomb that killed, maimed, and spread terror in our nation's largest city. The FBI must not only catch those who have committed crimes, it must be an important step ahead of criminals, as often as possible, to prevent crime from being committed. It also has the unique ability in a democratic society to exculpate the innocent. In our country's rich traditions, we must make certain that the best of the past is surely the prologue of the challenges we face today and in the future. Before going on the Supreme Court, Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone set into motion in the 1920s reforms that eventually led to the outstanding FBI of today. An FBI which has been strengthened by Judge Sessions' efforts to diversify its excellent workforce. These important efforts should be continued and strengthened. At its bedrock, the FBI must stand for absolute integrity, be free of all political influence, be free of any racial or other bias, and work solely in the public interest.
Tell us more about Louis Freeh is what we are going to say now to Don Bair, Assistant Managing Editor of U.S. News and World Report, who covered Freeh's work at the Justice Department and the FBI, and to Frank Story, a former Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's New York City office. He was in charge of the FBI's Organized Crime Unit, in which Freeh worked as a prosecutor. Don Bair, how would you describe Louis Freeh?
Well, I think one of the things you have to know about him is that he brings nearly unique circumstances to this job and experience. You know, he's been an FBI agent, a federal prosecutor, and a federal judge. And that's almost unheard of in the whole federal prosecution and federal system. The importance of all those things is that he understands the inner workings of the FBI. He knows, from having been a prosecutor, how cases are put together in a meticulous fashion, in particular big, long-term cases like the Pizza Connection case in New York. And as a federal judge, he brings the strong suit, the one strong suit that his two predecessors brought to the job, which is William Webster and William Sessions, a sense of rectitude and probity that we expect to find in a federal judge.
Frank Story, how would you describe him?
Extremely dedicated, innovative individual who led the fight against organized crime in the early 80s, a hard-working person, a good person, a man of...
Is he a tough guy?
He's a man of integrity. I wouldn't describe Judge Freeh as a tough man, but he certainly made a lot of tough decisions during the organized crime investigations in the 1980s, in particular the Pizza Connection case, which was an investigation that lasted 4 years. The prosecutorial input that he provided was outstanding.
You worked on that case, too, with him.
I worked on that case. I was in charge of the organized crime program at that particular time.
So when President Clinton described him today as a law enforcement legend, which sounds kind of strange, a guy only being 43 years old, is that what the reference, that's what it's referring to, is the Pizza Connection case?
I would say the Pizza Connection case, the other organized crime investigations, a lot of these investigations were very innovative, long-term in nature. The efforts that we made at that time were unprecedented, and he had a big part in that.
Yeah. Would you agree with that, Don Bair, that was the case? Well, you mentioned it in your, that was the case that has given him this moniker, law enforcement legend?
Yeah, basically that's right, Jim. Although I would say this about Louis Freeh. When you meet him, and I met him several years ago in covering some of the later Pizza Connection cases, you're struck immediately by how unusual he is in the context of some federal law enforcement circles. I remember meeting him, and he doesn't strike you as the kind of fellow who is a top-flight federal law prosecutor, especially in the district that he worked in, which is the Southern District of New York. Frank Story can tell you that's the creme de la creme of the federal prosecution force. Quite often you run into people there with Ivy League backgrounds who come from big, fancy Park Avenue law firms before they go back into government service. Louis Freeh was nothing like that, and it was amazing that despite the fact that he didn't have that kind of paper credential and didn't stand out in that way, that he was generally regarded as one of the best prosecutors in the office.
Anything you want to add to that?
Well, I would add he was an agent's agent, an agent's prosecutor. He was well respected within the FBI while he was an agent. While he was a federal prosecutor, he was well respected. He's a true human being in the sense that he's a good family man. He's well-rounded. He has good common sense approach to solve difficult problems. He's an outstanding choice. The president could have made a better choice than he made today.
Will the agents will the FBI agents consider him an insider or an outsider coming in?
I would think they would consider him a little bit of both. He was with the FBI for 6 years. He's very close to the Bureau during his tenure as a federal prosecutor. But he's done an awful lot outside the FBI as well as in the FBI. So you have a very unique person here. He brings an awful lot to the table, and I just don't think you could find a better man to lead the Bureau where it should go in the future.
Don Bair, does it concern some people that he does come from the FBI and he does come from federal law enforcement, that he may not bring an outside perspective, or is that even what is needed right now?
Well, let me say this. He came of age in the FBI at a time, as Frank can tell you, that was very difficult for the FBI when it was going through the transformation after the Hoover years, and that's when he grew up in the FBI. So he understands the difficulties and the need for the FBI to continue to transform itself. So I think from that standpoint he'll be good. One of the real problems that William Sessions ran into, as you know, is that he was an outsider, and he never got along well with the bureaucracy inside the FBI, and in the end, some people argue that was his undoing. Louis Freeh should not have the same kind of problems. And yet, as I say, having been a federal judge, having been a fellow who has always done it his way, done it down the line, but done it his way, he ought to be able to be independent. I would say also it's interesting that he should look independent from the president and from the Justice Department as well. This is not somebody who's a part of the inner circle of the Clinton campaign. In fact, there's no evidence to suggest he even voted for President Clinton last fall. And to that extent, I think it probably will work well with him, both with the FBI and with the public.
You agree that he'll be an independent person, Frank Story?
Yes, I do. I think he will be independent. In fact, when he was a federal prosecutor and we were on the investigative side in the Pizza Connection case and other organized crime investigations, he maintained that independence. He was very objective in his thoughts and his counsel to us as investigators. We worked very well together as a team. But when he made a decision from a prosecutorial sense, that was the decision. He wasn't influenced by what we had to say.
You've mentioned many great things about the guy. What is the best thing about him? What does he do best as a law enforcement or prosecutor?
Well, he's very organized. He's very innovative. A lot of the approaches that he initiated during the commission case, during the Pizza Connection case, were very innovative from a prosecutive sense. But then also as an investigator, he worked a major labor racketeering case in the late 1970s entitled UNIRAC. It was the first multi-divisional approach to labor racketeering in the country. So he's done it as an investigator, as a prosecutor, and also as a federal judge.
What are his weaknesses?
To be honest with you, he doesn't have any. The only I used to marvel.
Unlike every other human being?
Well, I used to marvel at the long hours he would work. And, of course, in the early years, he wasn't married. He married a little later in life. He now has 4 children, so he's going to have to find time to spend with them. But to be honest with you, he doesn't have any weaknesses that I'm aware of.
Don Bair, the FBI, you talked about the transformation process that's still underway. What is your reading of what that transformation should continue to head for? In other words, what still needs to be done to make the FBI attuned to what's going on in this country and what the needs are, the Justice Department and law enforcement generally?
Well, there's no question that we've got a law enforcement or a crime crisis in the country still. The extent to which the FBI director can move forward and get the FBI and federal law enforcement more fully involved in street consideration, street crime, problems that are ongoing, move some of the big cases like Pizza Connection and the racketeering cases into other areas. And of course, in some of the more traditional areas, such as drug enforcement and whatnot, there's real need to improve on the going after Asian crime syndicates and whatnot, where in the past they've been looking more at Italian crime syndicates. So those are the kinds of things they need to do. Now, Louis Freeh may also run into some tensions with justice in the White House over some of the things that we've heard those two institutions want the FBI to move into, and that the FBI bureaucracy itself is somewhat resistant about.
Like what?
There's been talk about having the FBI track down deadbeat dads as part of welfare reform. There's been talk about having the FBI to monitor anti-abortion protesting more. These are things that are not part of the traditional function of the FBI, and that I suspect Louis Freeh, as someone who appreciates the limits as well as the reach of the FBI, will be somewhat concerned about.
Would you agree with that?
I would agree in part with what Don's saying. I think the Bureau has to be focused on major criminal activity, as they have in the past. They can't be diverted to areas that they have no business being in. There's a need to look at...
But isn't that somebody else's decision to make rather than the FBI's?
Well, the FBI has to be able to provide objective input into those decisions. The decisions are reached collectively with the Department of Justice and other organizations in Washington. But the FBI cannot turn its back on what it's done in the past. There's a need to look at the reallocation of resources relating to foreign counterintelligence. Where are we going to go in the 90s with the events that have taken place in Europe and so forth? And that's important. There's a need for strong leadership. He will apply that to the FBI. He will have the confidence of the Bureau behind him, and I think he'll take the FBI where it should go in the 90s.
This whole Sessions agony that went on for 6 months, there's been much written and much spoken about, not only in the last 24 hours, but even before that, about the damage this has done internally, whichever position you might take on it, but the damage that has been done as a result of this within the FBI. How would you assess that, and what do you think Louis Freeh must do quickly to correct it?
He must assume a strong leadership position. He has to lead. He has an extremely good record to do that. There's a lot of fine executives in the FBI that are looking for that leadership. The FBI is a very resilient, very strong organization. They've gone through troubled times in the past and have always righted themselves, and I think they will this time. There is some morale problems naturally when something like this occurs, but the FBI is a very dedicated law enforcement organization that is really geared towards fighting major criminal activities, and that's what they'll be doing in the future.
Don Bair, what kind of difficulty does Louis Freeh inherit?
Well, I think much of the morale problem has been overstated with regard to Sessions. It's been a big problem up at the top. I don't think the drift has taken place for that long, and the FBI has continued to move along on some of its more important cases. However, I do think what he has to do now he may have to employ certain kinds of techniques that aren't his strongest suits. Mainly, he's got to be a very good manager and executive at this point, and that's probably where he has the least experience. He has run big prosecution forces of a couple of hundred agents and several lawyers and whatnot. But as a federal judge, and this has been the problem that both Sessions and Webster both ran into, you don't run much of anything. You run your chambers, and that's about it. So he's going to have to come in and be a strong executive and manager, lay down some very specific and precise goals and get moving on that. And it'll be interesting to see how quickly he's able to move.
Yeah, and that is his number one task, is it not? It's to manage, 22,000 people who work for the FBI.
Right.
That's his number one job, is it not?
That is his number one job, and as I say, that's probably his weakest suit. It is an enormous bureaucracy, and it's a big task, and as we've said, it's a bureaucracy that's undergoing a big transformation right now. Not just because of Sessions leaving and a new director coming in, but because of minorities and women who have been brought in during the Webster and Sessions period, new kinds of cases that they may be asked to undertake. So it will be a very big task.
All right. Don Bair, Frank Story, thank you both very much.
Thank you.